This documentary is written for the quiet hours. It is written for the moment between waking and sleep, when the mind is soft and open and willing to travel without resistance. There is no urgency in these pages, no examination to prepare for, no dates to memorize. Instead, think of this as a gentle drift down a great river, the Yellow River perhaps, or the Yangtze, moving slowly through a landscape of mist and mountains, past fields of millet and paddies of rice, past walled cities and village temples and scholars sitting in pavilions writing poems about the moon. China is the oldest continuous civilization on Earth. That is not a boast but simply a fact, and a fact that deserves to be held gently, because it means something almost beyond comprehension, that the thread of cultural memory stretching from the farmers of the Yellow River Valley to the present day spans more than 4,000 years of recorded history, and perhaps twice that of human habitation and cultural development. No other civilization can make that claim with equal credibility. We will move through that history slowly, chapter by chapter, from the mythological beginnings to the great dynasties that shaped not only China but much of the world. We will walk through jade-green valleys and across the stones of the Great Wall. We will sit in the courts of emperors and in the huts of farmers. We will listen to philosophers argue about the nature of virtue, and to generals planning campaigns across steppes so vast that the horizon is simply more sky. Let the words carry you. Let the images come and go like clouds over a mountain. You are not being tested. You are simply traveling. Close your eyes if you like, breathe slowly, and let us begin. Chapter 1: The River and the Beginning. In the beginning, before there was a China, there was a river. The Yellow River, the Huanghe, rises in the mountains of the Tibetan Plateau and flows eastward for nearly 5,000 kilometers before emptying into the sea. It carries with it an enormous load of yellow-brown silt, less, picked up from the Great Plateau of northern China, and it is this silt that gives the river its color and its name, and that gave the land its fertility. The less soil of the Yellow River Valley is among the most productive in the world, deep and easily worked, warm and well-drained. It was the kind of soil that rewarded the effort of farming so dependably that people who came to it and learned its rhythms rarely wanted to leave. People had been living in northern China for a very long time before anything we would recognize as civilization appeared. Peking man, Homo erectus fossils found near Beijing, dates to perhaps 700,000 years ago. By 40,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans were present across much of the region. They hunted and gathered in the forests and grasslands, fished the rivers, and moved with the seasons as people everywhere did in those long centuries before farming changed the fundamental relationship between human beings and the land they lived on. The shift to agriculture in China seems to have happened independently of the agricultural revolutions in the Middle East, which is one of the things that makes Chinese civilization particularly interesting to the historian of deep time. Around 10,000 years ago, people in the Yellow River Valley began cultivating millet, that hardy, drought-resistant grain that would sustain northern Chinese civilization for millennia. In the Yangtze River Valley further south, a different agricultural revolution was underway, centered on rice, the crop that would eventually feed more human beings than any other in history. These early farmers built villages. The village of Bampo, near the modern city of Xi'an, was occupied from roughly 4,800 to 3,600 BCE and gives us a remarkable window into Neolithic life in the Yellow River Valley. The people of Bampo lived in round and square semi-subterranean houses with thatched roofs. They kept pigs and dogs, grew millet, fished in the nearby river, and made pottery decorated with geometric patterns and stylized fish. They buried their dead in a cemetery set apart from the village, sometimes with grave goods, pots, tools, ornaments made of bone. There is something both intimate and haunting about Bampo. The post holes in the earth where the house walls stood, the fire pits in the center of the floors, the fish hooks made of bone, the children's jars buried under the house thresholds, all of it speaks of a community that was fully alive, fully human, fully present in its world. These were not primitive people struggling blindly in the dark. They were skilled farmers, competent potters, people with social organization and aesthetic sensibility, people who loved their children and mourned their dead, and tried to make sense of the world they found themselves in. From villages like Bampo, and from hundreds of other Neolithic settlements scattered across the Yellow River Valley and beyond, Chinese civilization slowly grew. It did not happen overnight or in a generation. It happened over thousands of years, through the gradual accumulation of knowledge and technique, through the slow development of more complex social organization, through the emergence of craft specialization and trade, and the hierarchies that trade and specialization tend to produce. By the 3rd millennium BCE, something new was appearing in the archaeological record. Signs of social stratification, of leaders and followers, of people who had more and people who had less. Certain graves contained far more goods than others, and some of those goods were made of jade, the semi-precious stone that would become one of the most significant materials in Chinese culture, associated with virtue and immortality and the power of the elite. The people who possessed jade in death had presumably possessed power in life. And from power comes the impulse to tell stories about that power, to give it divine sanction, to weave it into narratives that explain why things are the way they are. The Chinese did this, as all civilizations do, through myth. The great myths of Chinese origin are populated with culture heroes, semi-divine figures who gave humanity its essential tools and knowledge. Fuxi, the snake-bodied sage, taught the people to fish and hunt and understood the patterns of heaven and earth, from which he derived the 8 trigrams that became the foundation of the I Ching, the Book of Changes. Shenang, the divine farmer, taught agriculture and the use of medicinal herbs, tasting plants himself to discover which were healing and which were poisonous, saving his people from ignorance and disease. Huangdi, the yellow emperor whose name echoes the color of the river and the soil, was said to have united the many tribes of the Central Plain and laid the foundations of Chinese civilization. He invented writing, the compass, the calendar, sericulture, the art of making silk from the cocoons of silkworms. These are myths, not history, but myths carry their own kind of truth. They tell us what a civilization values, what it considers foundational, what it believes its essential identity to be. Chinese civilization, the myths say, is built on the knowledge of nature, on agriculture and medicine and practical wisdom, on the ordering of heaven and earth, on writing and record-keeping. These are not the myths of warriors or conquerors, of gods who fight and destroy. They are the myths of farmers and sages, of people who understand that survival depends on understanding the world rather than dominating it. The Yellow Emperor fights in these myths, it is true. He defeats the monster Qiyu in a great battle that fills the sky with storms. But the battle is a foundation for order, not an end in itself. When it is over, the Yellow Emperor returns to the work of civilization. This is where it all begins. Not with a trumpet blast or a divine proclamation, but with people working the good soil of the Yellow River Valley, learning the rhythms of the seasons, developing the tools and techniques and social structures that would eventually produce something the world had never quite seen before. Let us stay here for a moment in this early world before history began writing itself down. The air smells of wood smoke and damp earth. The millet is green in the fields. A dog barks somewhere in the village. A woman is shaping clay into a pot, pressing the walls thin and even with practiced hands, her fingers moving in patterns learned from her mother and her mother's mother before that. The river glitters in the distance, yellow-brown and steady, moving always eastward toward the sea. This is where China begins. Chapter 2, Yao, Shun, and Yu, the Age of Sage Kings. Before the dynasties, Chinese tradition speaks of a golden age of sage kings. Rulers so virtuous and wise that heaven itself approved of their reigns, and the people flourished under their governance. The most famous of these sage kings are the 3 who are spoken of together, Yao, Shun, and Yu. They are not mythological figures in quite the same sense as Fuxi and the Yellow Emperor. They exist at the edge where legend begins to touch something that might be historical memory, though the boundary is impossible to define with certainty. Yao is said to have been an emperor of profound wisdom, who governed not through force or personal ambition but through the power of his virtue, his de. Under his rule, the people knew their duties and performed them willingly. He was attentive to the seasons, organizing the calendar so that the farmers knew when to plant and when to harvest. He was just in his judgments and modest in his person. He lived simply, ate plainly, wore unadorned clothes. When the time came for Yao to consider a successor, he did not choose one of his own sons who were unworthy. Instead, he searched the empire for a man of virtue, a man who could genuinely serve the people, and found Shun, a farmer of low birth but exceptional character. Shun had been raised in a difficult family. His father was weak and foolish, his stepmother cruel, his stepbrother arrogant and vindictive. Yet Shun had responded to all this mistreatment with unfailing filial piety and patience, caring for his family without complaint, maintaining his virtue in circumstances that would have broken a lesser man. Yao tested Shun rigorously before confirming him as successor, sending his own daughters to live with Shun as wives, observing how he managed his household, giving him various administrative tasks to see how he handled them. Shun passed every test. He became emperor, and under his rule the people continued to flourish. Shun, too, chose his successor not from his own family, but from among the most capable and virtuous men of the realm. He chose Yu, who had distinguished himself by solving a problem that had plagued the Central Plain for decades, the flooding of the great rivers. The floods were catastrophic. The Yellow River, which gave so much, also took much away. When its waters rose too high, which happened regularly, they inundated the fields and drowned the villages and drove the people from their homes. Previous attempts to control the floods by building dikes had failed. The water simply broke through and caused even more damage. Yu's solution was different. Instead of trying to wall the water in, he worked with it, dredging channels to give the floodwaters paths to follow, directing them away from settled areas and toward the sea. The work took 13 years. During those 13 years, Yu traveled constantly across the land, overseeing the digging of canals and channels, sleeping in the open, sharing the hardships of the laborers. The story says that 3 times during those years he passed by the door of his own home and heard his wife and children within, and 3 times he did not stop to go inside, because the work was not yet done and the people needed him. When the floods were finally controlled, the people were so grateful and Shun so impressed that Yu was confirmed as the next emperor. He ruled well, and when he died his son inherited the throne, which is how the first dynasty, the Xia, is traditionally said to have begun. The stories of Yao, Shun, and Yu encode the deepest values of Chinese political thought. The idea that a ruler's legitimacy comes not from his birth or his force, but from his virtue, from his genuine service to the people and the land. The concept of the mandate of heaven, the Tiananmen, which would shape Chinese political philosophy for thousands of years, is already implicit in these stories. Heaven Tian approves of virtuous rulers and withdraws its approval from corrupt ones. The floods recede under a good king. The harvests are plentiful. The people are at peace. And when a ruler loses virtue, heaven signals its disapproval through disasters, floods, famines, rebellions. The ruler who cannot maintain the mandate loses the right to rule. This idea, so different from the divine right of kings in European tradition, placed a perpetual moral burden on every Chinese ruler. Legitimacy was not inherited once and kept forever. It had to be earned continuously through good governance. It could always be lost, and when it was lost, the people were not simply permitted but morally obligated to replace the ruler with someone better. The sage kings themselves, Yao, Shun, Yu, became models and touchstones for Chinese political philosophy, invoked by philosophers and reformers for thousands of years. When Confucius wanted to argue for a return to virtuous governance, he pointed to the sage kings. When later reformers wanted to argue against a corrupt emperor, They pointed to the sage kings. The Golden Age at the beginning of time served as a constant standard against which the present could be measured and found wanting, and toward which the future might aspire. Whether Yao, Shun, and Yu were real people is a question that historians have debated without reaching a definitive answer. What is not in question is the reality of the values they represent: service, virtue, selflessness, attentiveness to the natural world and its demands. These values are as old as Chinese civilization itself, and they are still recognizable today. Chapter 3: The Xia and the Shang, Dawn of the Dynasties. The Xia dynasty, traditionally dated from around 2070 to 1600 BCE, occupies a peculiar position in Chinese history. For most of the modern era, it was considered purely legendary, the invention of later writers who wanted to give Chinese history a satisfyingly ancient foundation. Then, in the 20th century, archaeologists began finding things. At Erlitou, in Henan province, excavations beginning in the 1950s revealed the remains of a settlement that dates to roughly 1900 to 1500 BCE and shows signs of being something more than an ordinary village. There are large palatial structures, bronze workshops, evidence of specialized craft production, a degree of social organization and architectural sophistication that speaks of a complex polity rather than a simple agricultural community. Whether Erlitou is actually the capital of the Xia dynasty, as some Chinese scholars argue, or a pre-Shang civilization of some other kind, is still debated. But whatever Erlitou was, it demonstrates that complex political and social organization existed in the Yellow River Valley long before the first dynasty that can be confirmed with written records. That first confirmed dynasty is the Shang, which ruled the Central Plain from roughly 1600 to 1046 BCE, and which left behind a remarkable record. The Shang dynasty was rediscovered, in a sense, through a peculiar route. In the late 19th century, Chinese pharmacists and scholars began noticing that bones sold as dragon bones in traditional medicine markets were sometimes inscribed with an archaic script. These bones turned out to be oracle bones, the shoulder blades of cattle and the plastrons of turtles that had been used in Shang divination ritual and then discarded or stored in royal archives. When excavations began at Anyang in Henan province, the site of the last Shang capital, they uncovered hundreds of thousands of these inscribed bones. The oracle bones are the oldest surviving corpus of Chinese writing, and they tell us an enormous amount about Shang civilization. The Shang king was also the chief diviner of the state, the intermediary between the human world and the supernatural world, which included not only the high god Dai and various nature spirits, but also the spirits of royal ancestors, who continued to exert influence over the living and required propitiation through sacrifice and ritual. Divination using the oracle bones followed a set procedure. The diviner would apply heat to a prepared bone or shell until it cracked. The pattern of cracks was then interpreted as an answer from the spirits to whatever question had been posed. The question and sometimes the answer were inscribed on the bone itself. Will it rain? Will the harvest be good? Should the king go to war? Will the queen give birth safely? Will the sick person recover? The bones record thousands of such consultations, and reading them gives the historian a remarkable sense of the texture of Shang royal life. The Shang world was a world in which the boundaries between the human and the supernatural were permeable and constantly maintained through ritual. The royal ancestors had to be fed with sacrifice. Food, drink, and animals were offered regularly. More troubling to modern eyes, human sacrifice was also practiced on a significant scale, particularly at the funerals of great kings. When hundreds of retainers and servants might be killed to accompany the ruler into the afterlife. The royal tombs at Anyang contain the remains of hundreds of sacrificial victims, some of them clearly killed in ritual fashion, some of them in pits that suggest mass interment. But the Shang world was not only blood and sacrifice. It was also a world of extraordinary artistic achievement. The bronze vessels of the Shang dynasty are among the most technically accomplished objects produced anywhere in the world in the second millennium BCE. They were cast using the piece mold technique, in which clay molds were assembled around a clay core, molten bronze was poured in, and the molds removed to reveal the finished object. The results were intricate, heavy vessels decorated with swirling designs called taoti, a kind of mask or face pattern whose exact meaning is still debated by scholars, but whose technical execution is breathtaking in its precision and ambition. These bronze vessels were not everyday objects. They were ritual containers used in the ceremonies that maintained the relationship between the living and the dead, between the human world and the spirit world. To possess them was to possess power, and the number and quality of bronzes buried in a person's tomb was a direct measure of their social rank. The Shang elite were buried with extraordinary quantities of bronze, jade, bone, ivory, and lacquer, the accumulated luxury of a ruling class that had grown very wealthy on the labor of the people they governed. Outside the elite, the majority of Shang people were farmers, living in villages not very different from the Neolithic villages that had preceded them, working the land with stone and bone tools, paying tribute in the form of agricultural produce and labor, sometimes being conscripted into the armies that the Shang kings used to maintain their authority over their neighbors and to capture the sacrificial victims they needed for their rituals. The Shang state was not a tightly centralized empire in the modern sense. It was a network of relationships radiating outward from the king, with loyal nobles governing territories in return for military service and tribute. Beyond the directly governed territories were more loosely affiliated peoples and polities, some of which would eventually challenge Shang dominance. The challenge came from the west. The Zhou people, living on the western margins of the Shang cultural sphere, had absorbed much of Shang culture and technology while maintaining their own identity and building their own strength. Under their leader King Wen and then his son King Wu, they marched against the last Shang king Zhu, who is remembered in Chinese tradition as a tyrant of almost cartoonish wickedness. Cruel, lustful, dissolute, a man who had lost heaven's mandate through his own depravity. The Battle of Mu, around 1046 BCE, ended the Shang dynasty. King Zhu reportedly burned himself to death in his palace rather than be captured. The Zhou became the new rulers of the Central Plain, and they brought with them ideas about governance and legitimacy that would shape Chinese civilization for the next 3,000 years. Chapter 4: The Zhou Dynasty, Feudalism and the Birth of Chinese Philosophy. The Zhou Dynasty is the longest in Chinese history, spanning from 1046 to 256 BCE, more than 8 centuries. It is also one of the most intellectually fertile periods in the history of any civilization anywhere, producing a flowering of philosophical thought that Chinese culture would never entirely exhaust. But the Zhou began as conquerors who needed a way to govern a large territory with the means available to them, which did not include a professional bureaucracy or a standing army capable of garrisoning every corner of the realm. Their solution was a system that modern historians often call Chinese feudalism, though the analogy to European feudalism is imperfect. The king parceled out territories to loyal relatives and allies, who governed those territories as lords in return for military service and tribute. These lords in turn parceled out smaller territories to their own followers, and so on down through the hierarchy. The system worked reasonably well for the first period of Zhou rule, the Western Zhou, when the capital was in the west near modern Xi'an, and the king's authority was genuinely effective. But it contained the seeds of its own dissolution. As generations passed, and the original bonds of personal loyalty between the king and the lords faded, as the lords' territories grew in population and wealth, and as the lords began to develop their own identities and interests separate from those of the Zhou king, the center's grip weakened. In 771 BCE, the Western Zhou capital was sacked by a confederation of Western peoples, possibly including some discontented Zhou lords. The king was killed. The dynasty survived, but only by moving the capital east to Luoyi, near modern Luoyang, and the Eastern Zhou period that followed was defined by the progressive weakening of royal authority and the growing power of the territorial lords. The Eastern Zhou is traditionally divided into two periods. The Spring and Autumn period, from 770 to 476 BCE, when there were still many states competing for influence under a nominally paramount Zhou king, and the Warring States period, from 475 to 221 BCE, when the competition had narrowed to a handful of powerful states engaged in almost perpetual war with each other, and with the Zhou king reduced to a figurehead of no practical importance. This might sound like a story of decline and chaos, and in political and military terms, it often was. But it was also the period that produced the 100 schools of thought, the extraordinary efflorescence of philosophical inquiry that transformed Chinese civilization. The circumstances that produced this flowering are not coincidental. In a world where political certainty had dissolved, where the old order of Zhou feudalism was clearly not working and no new order had yet emerged to replace it, thinking people were free and indeed compelled to ask fundamental questions. What is the right way to govern? What is the nature of the good life? What is the proper relationship between ruler and subject, parent and child, individual and community? What is the nature of reality itself? What is virtue and how is it cultivated? Different thinkers gave different answers, and the conversation between those different answers has never quite stopped. The most influential of all the thinkers of this period was Kangxi, known to the Western world by the Latinized name Confucius. He was born in 551 BCE in the small state of Lu, in what is today Shandong province, and died in 479 BCE, having spent much of his life trying, unsuccessfully in the short term, to find a ruler willing to implement his ideas about governance. Confucius was not primarily a metaphysician or a theologian. He was a social philosopher, concerned above all with the practical question of how human beings should live together. His answers centered on a cluster of related concepts: Ren, which is often translated as benevolence or humaneness; Li, ritual propriety, the correct performance of the ceremonies and social forms that bind a community together; Yi, righteousness; and Zhai, wisdom. Together, these virtues constituted the ideal of the Junzi, the gentleman or superior person, whose personal cultivation of virtue made them fit to serve in government and to be an example to those around them. For Confucius, the family was the fundamental unit of social order, and the virtues cultivated within the family, above all filial piety, Zhao, the respectful love of children for parents, could be extended outward to encompass the ruler's relationship with the people and the individual's relationship with all of society. A ruler who genuinely cared for the people as a good parent cares for children would naturally govern well. A person who had learned to be a good child would naturally be a good citizen and official. Confucius also believed deeply in the importance of ritual and music as means of moral cultivation, not as empty forms but as practices that, properly understood and performed, shaped the character of the performer. He was a great lover of the ancient Zhou culture, which he idealized as a time when the social forms were correct and people knew their proper roles and performed them with appropriate feeling. His political goal was to restore something like that ancient order, though his conception of it was clearly more philosophical than historical. In his own lifetime, Confucius was largely a failure as a political figure. He traveled from state to state seeking a ruler willing to implement his program of government by virtue, and found none. He gathered students, taught them, transmitted his understanding of the ancient texts, and left behind a body of recorded conversations, the Analects, that became one of the foundational texts of Chinese civilization. The irony, which Confucius himself would certainly have appreciated, is that the man who failed to find a ruler to listen to him became the most influential thinker in Chinese history, shaping the values and the educational system and the political philosophy of China for more than 2,000 years. Confucianism was not the only important school of thought to emerge from this period. Taoism, associated with the legendary figure Laozi and developed by the thinkers Yuanzi, offered a very different vision of the good life. Where Confucianism emphasized social relationship and ritual, Taoism emphasized the individual's relationship with the Tao, the way, the underlying principle of the universe that preceded and encompassed all things. The Tao cannot be defined or captured in words, because words are human constructs, and the Tao transcends all human constructs. It is the spontaneous, unforced flow of nature, the way water moves and seasons change and plants grow, without effort or intention, simply following the pattern that is their nature. The sage who understands the Tao does not force things but moves with them, practicing Wu Wei, non-action or effortless action, allowing things to unfold according to their own nature rather than imposing an external will upon them. The Taoist critique of Confucianism is that all the social rituals and hierarchies and moral categories that Confucius wanted to restore were themselves departures from the natural order, human impositions on the flowing simplicity of the Tao. The more rules you make, the more things go wrong. The more virtue you promote, the more people demonstrate its absence. The ideal state in the Taoist vision is the small village where people live simply and close to nature, where no one is trying to impose an order on anyone else, where the Tao flows undisturbed. Moism, founded by Mozi in the 5th century BCE, offered a third alternative, a philosophy of universal love and practical utility. Where Confucianism emphasized differentiated love, the idea that you naturally love your own family more than strangers, Mozi argued for impartial love, giant AI, a concern for all people equally, without distinction. He also argued for practical usefulness as the criterion for evaluating all activities. Music, elaborate funerals, costly ritual, all the things that Confucianism valued, Mozi condemned as wasteful and harmful to the people's welfare. Legalism, represented most fully by Shang Yang and Han Fei, was the most radical of the major schools. It argued that human nature was fundamentally self-interested, and that good governance required not the cultivation of virtue, but the creation of laws with clear rewards and punishments that channeled self-interest in productive directions. Forget moral education. Design the incentives correctly, and even selfish people will behave in ways that benefit the state. These schools of thought competed for influence with the rulers of the warring states, each proposing itself as the key to political survival and eventual supremacy. As the states fought and absorbed each other, and the surviving few grew larger and more powerful, the practical question of which philosophy would actually work in the real world of state competition became increasingly urgent. The answer, when it came, was legalism. The state that would eventually unify China was not the most Confucian or the most Taoist, but the most thoroughly legalist. Chapter 5: The Warring States, Fire and Strategy. The Warring States period, from 475 to 221 BCE, was one of the most violent and also one of the most intellectually productive eras in Chinese history. It was a time when the map of the Central Plain was being redrawn almost constantly by military conflict, when states rose and fell and were absorbed by their neighbors, when the science of warfare was being developed with systematic rigor for the first time in the world. The greatest military treatise ever written was produced in this period. The Art of War, attributed to Sun Tzu or Sun Tzu, is a slim book of 13 chapters that has been read and debated by military commanders, business strategists, politicians, and athletes for 2,500 years. Its central insight, stated in various ways across the text, is that the highest form of victory is to win without fighting, to achieve your objectives through superior intelligence, deception, and positioning, so that the enemy is defeated before the battle begins. All warfare is based on deception, Sun Tzu writes. When strong, appear weak. When weak, appear strong. Know your enemy and know yourself, and you need not fear the result of 100 battles. The general who wins a battle makes many calculations in his temple before the battle is fought. These ideas were not abstract philosophical positions. They emerged from a world in which military competition was a matter of state survival, where the losers were absorbed or destroyed, and their populations enslaved or dispersed. The Warring States period produced genuine strategic innovation. The shift from chariot-based warfare to mass infantry armies, the development of cavalry, the use of iron weapons rather than bronze, the construction of massive defensive walls along borders, and the evolution of siege warfare to a high art. The states that survived longest and eventually came to dominate were those that most successfully reformed their military and administrative systems. The state of Wei implemented sweeping reforms under the statesman Li Kui in the early 4th century BCE, rationalizing agriculture and law. The state of Qi became known for its culture and its Jixia Academy, a kind of government-sponsored institute where scholars of all schools could gather and debate, perhaps the first institution in the world devoted to what we might call think tank intellectual work. But it was the state of Qin, in the West, that would ultimately emerge victorious. Qin was considered semi-barbarous by the more cultured states of the Central Plain, which turned out to be partly an advantage. Qin had fewer entrenched interests to overcome when it came to radical reform. In 361 BCE, the Qin ruler brought in the legalist reformer Shang Yang, who proceeded to transform the state from the ground up. Shang Yang's reforms were ruthless and comprehensive. He abolished the old aristocratic privileges that had made the hereditary nobility a power center independent of the ruler. He organized the population into small groups mutually responsible for each other's behavior, creating a system of collective punishment that made everyone a watchman over their neighbors. He made agriculture and military service the only routes to status and advancement. Anyone who grew more grain or killed more enemies would be rewarded. Anyone who engaged in commerce or other activities Shang Yang considered unproductive would be penalized. He standardized weights, measures, and the law across the state. The effect was to create a highly disciplined, militarized society in which every element was oriented toward the goal of state power. Qin armies fought with terrifying effectiveness. The terracotta warriors buried near the first emperor's tomb, which were not created until much later, give some sense of the standardized, organized military machine that Shang Yang's reforms created. Shang Yang himself came to a bad end. When the ruler who had patronized him died, his enemies had him arrested and torn apart by chariots. But his reforms survived him, encoded in Qin law and practice, and the state he had shaped continued to grow stronger while its rivals weakened. The Warring States period produced not only warfare and philosophy, but also a remarkable culture of bronze and lacquer art, of poetry and music, of silk and jade, and the early development of Chinese writing toward the forms that would eventually become the classical script. The Book of Songs, an anthology of poems from the early Zhou period that Confucius reportedly edited, gives us the voices of ordinary people. Farmers celebrating the harvest, soldiers longing for home, lovers separated by circumstance, women waiting for men who may not return. One poem from the Book of Songs imagines a young woman gathering water plants by the river, and the sound of her activity, the splash of water and the creak of her gathering basket, carry across the centuries with a simplicity that needs no scholarly apparatus to be felt. These are human voices, speaking of human things, and they reach us across 2,500 years with their humanity intact. The Warring States period was ending. The great conversation of the 100 schools of thought was being overtaken by events. The sword was answering the questions that philosophy had left open. In 256 BCE, The Zhou king died and the dynasty expired. In 221 BCE, after a final campaign in which the king of Qin absorbed the last independent states one by one, a new ruler stood at the center of a unified Chinese realm and gave himself a new title, Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of Qin. Chapter 6. The First Emperor and the Qin Dynasty. Qin Shi Huangdi is one of the most remarkable figures in world history. A man who genuinely created something new, who ended one world and began another, and who remains, more than 2,000 years after his death, one of the most discussed and debated rulers in the Chinese tradition. He was born in 259 BCE as Wang Zheng, Prince of Qin. He became king of Qin at the age of 13, with a regent governing in his name during his minority. At 22, he took personal power. Over the next decade, in a series of military campaigns prosecuted with brutal efficiency, he conquered Han, Zhao, Wei, Chu, Yan, and Qi, the 6 remaining major states that had survived the centuries of warring states competition. By 221 BCE, he ruled all of the Chinese cultural sphere, from the Yellow River Valley to the Yangtze Basin, from the Eastern Sea to the Western Mountains. The old title of King, Wang, was insufficient for what he had accomplished. He created a new title by combining the words for 3 of the legendary sage rulers, Huang, the most august divine rulers of antiquity, and Di, meaning emperor or sovereign. He was Shi Huangdi, the first august emperor. His successors, he decreed, would be the second emperor, the third emperor, and so on for 10,000 generations. There would not be a second emperor of Qin. The dynasty lasted 15 years, but in those 15 years it accomplished things that permanently changed China. The first emperor understood that political unification without cultural and administrative standardization was not real unification. He therefore set about imposing uniformity on the empire with the same systematic energy that Shang Yang had applied to Qin itself a century earlier. Writing was standardized. The many variant scripts used by the different states were replaced by a single official script, the small seal script, which could be read by educated people everywhere. Weights and measures were standardized. The widths of cart axles were standardized, which sounds trivial until you realize that roads wore ruts of a certain width and carts of the wrong width would be constantly running off the ruts, making efficient transport impossible. Coinage was standardized. The road system was extended and rationalized, with imperial highways radiating from the capital Xianyang like spokes from a wheel, allowing armies and officials and goods to move across the empire with unprecedented speed. A network of walls along the northern frontier, built by the various warring states to defend against the nomadic peoples of the steppe, was connected and extended into what would become, over succeeding centuries, the Great Wall. The first emperor also did something that left a deep wound in Chinese cultural memory. He burned the books. In 213 BCE, on the advice of his chancellor Li Si, the emperor decreed that histories of the individual states should be destroyed, along with all copies of the Confucian classics and the texts of the various philosophical schools. Only technical works on agriculture, medicine, divination, and the like would be spared. The purpose was clear. A unified empire needed a unified past, and the many different historical traditions of the warring states were a source of regional loyalty that competed with loyalty to the empire. The Confucian scholars who protested were reportedly buried alive, or at least some hundreds of them were. The burning of the books is remembered as one of the great cultural crimes of Chinese history. Many texts were indeed lost, but the damage was not as total as it might have been, because scholars hid books in walls and memorized texts, and after the Qin fell, many works were reconstructed from memory or discovered in their hiding places. The tradition survived, wounded but not destroyed. The first emperor's most astonishing monument was created not in his lifetime, but in preparation for his death. Near his capital, under a hill that later writers said was planted with grass and trees to resemble a natural feature of the landscape, he built a tomb of staggering ambition. It took hundreds of thousands of workers decades to construct. Ancient descriptions speak of a bronze-roofed underground palace with rivers of mercury simulating the empire's great rivers, with the constellations of the heavens mapped on the ceiling and the geography of Earth laid out on the floor, with crossbow traps set to kill grave robbers who forced their way in. The tomb itself has never been excavated, though the mercury content of the soil above it has been measured and found to be extraordinarily high, suggesting that the ancient descriptions may not be entirely fantastic. What has been excavated is the extraordinary outer precinct, where in 1974 farmers drilling a well accidentally broke through the ceiling of a pit and found the first of what would turn out to be thousands of life-size terracotta warriors, horses, chariots, and officials arranged in battle formation to guard the emperor's eternal domain. The terracotta army is one of the great archaeological wonders of the world. More than 8,000 individual figures have been identified so far, each with a distinct face, each originally painted in vivid colors, each equipped with real bronze weapons. They represent infantry, cavalry, archers, officers, generals, all the military might of the Qin Empire frozen in clay and arranged in the order they would take on the battlefield. They were meant to protect the emperor in death, as his army had protected him in life. The first emperor himself lived in a state of increasing paranoia. He was obsessed with immortality, sending expeditions to search for the islands of the immortals said to exist somewhere in the Eastern Sea, taking various potions and elixirs that may have contained mercury, and may thus have shortened the life he was trying to extend. He traveled constantly, inspecting his empire, erecting stone stelae with inscriptions praising his own achievements, never sleeping in the same place 2 nights running for fear of assassination. He died in 210 BCE on one of these tours, far from his capital. His death was concealed by his chief eunuch and Chancellor Li Si, who feared that the news would trigger the revolts they knew were simmering across the empire. The body was transported back to the capital in a covered carriage, with rotting fish placed in nearby carts to mask the smell, and when the court finally announced the death, it announced simultaneously the succession of the youngest son, who was more easily manipulated than the legitimate heir. The revolts came anyway. Within 3 years of the first emperor's death, the Qin Empire was collapsing. Within 15 years of his death, the dynasty was gone. The brevity of Qin is one of the great paradoxes of Chinese history. The dynasty that ended the warring states and unified China, that standardized writing and measurement and administration, that built the roads and connected the walls and imposed a framework of order on the vast Chinese world, lasted only 15 years. Everything it created was inherited by the dynasty that followed, the Han, which ruled for more than 4 centuries and gave the Han people, China's dominant ethnic group, their name. The first emperor failed, and yet without the first emperor there is no Han dynasty, no unified China, no continuous Chinese civilization as we know it. He is hated and celebrated, condemned and admired in Chinese culture to this day. Chapter 7. The Han Dynasty, the Classical Age. The Han Dynasty, which ruled China from 206 BCE to 220 CE with one brief interruption, was the period in which Chinese civilization came into its mature classical form. If the Qin established the framework, the Han filled it in, with a Confucian bureaucracy, with a great literature, with a philosophy of governance, with trade routes that reached to the Roman Empire, with a population census and a systematic approach to history, with jade and silk and the most sophisticated bronze casting yet achieved. The dynasty began in the chaos that followed the Qin collapse, when 2 major rebel leaders fought for control of the former Qin territory. One was Xiang Yu, the aristocratic military genius who won most of the battles. The other was Liu Bang, a former village headman of no particular family background, practical, shrewd, and possessed of the ability to attract and keep the loyalty of capable subordinates. Liu Bang won the final struggle in 202 BCE and became the first Han emperor, known by his temple name Geazu. Geazu's approach to governing was deliberately different from the harsh legalism of the Qin. He reduced taxes and labor obligations, allowed the people to recover from the devastation of years of civil war, and governed with a lighter hand. He kept some elements of Qin administrative structure, particularly the system of centrally appointed officials governing counties, but he also parceled out territories to his relatives and supporters in a nod to the old Zhou feudal tradition, creating a hybrid system that would require his successors to spend considerable energy resolving. The consolidation of Han power came under the Emperor Wu, Han Wudi, who reigned from 141 to 87 BCE and was one of the most dynamic rulers in Chinese history. Han Wudi's centralized power extended the empire's boundaries dramatically and made Confucianism the official ideology of the state in a move of lasting consequence. The decision to make Confucianism the basis of state education and official selection was not simply a philosophical choice. It was a political one. A Confucian education gave officials a common vocabulary, a shared set of texts and values, a basis for communication and mutual understanding that transcended regional differences. The five classics, the ancient texts that Confucius had supposedly edited, became the curriculum of the Imperial Academy, and the ability to master those texts became the pathway to government service. This was the beginning of what would eventually become the imperial examination system, one of the most remarkable institutions in the history of governance. A system in which entry into the bureaucracy depended not on birth, but on demonstrated intellectual mastery of the classical curriculum. In theory, any man who could pass the examinations could serve the state. In practice, the education required to pass the examinations was expensive and time-consuming, and the wealthy had enormous advantages. But the principle of merit, however imperfectly realized, was genuinely transformative, and the examination system in its mature form provided channels of upward mobility that most pre-modern societies entirely lacked. Han Wudi also pushed outward. His campaigns against the Xiongnu, the confederation of nomadic peoples on the northern steppe who had been a constant threat since the Qin period, drove them back from the frontier. He sent the great explorer and diplomat Zhang Qian on missions to the western regions, seeking allies against the Xiongnu and returning with information about the lands and peoples of Central Asia that opened Chinese eyes to a wider world. Zhang Qian's journeys were the beginning of what would become the Silk Road. He traveled as far as the Fergana Valley in modern Uzbekistan, brought back samples of grape wine and alfalfa and information about the powerful Parthian Empire to the west, and opened diplomatic relationships that would eventually grow into the sustained commercial and cultural exchange of the Silk Road. Chinese silk traveled westward, Roman glass and gold traveled eastward. Buddhism would eventually travel this road from India to China, one of the most consequential cultural transmissions in history. The Han state was also a great age of historiography. Sima Qian, the court astronomer and historian who served under Han Wudi, produced the Shiji, the records of the Grand Historian, which covered Chinese history from the mythological age of the Yellow Emperor down to his own time in more than 500,000 characters. The Shiji is not only a historical masterpiece, but a literary one, filled with vivid portraits of historical figures, dramatic narratives of key events, and occasional passages of startling personal revelation. Sima Qian suffered one of the most devastating punishments available under Han law, castration, inflicted when he defended a general who had surrendered to the Xiongnu and thereby offended the emperor. He survived the punishment and continued his work, finishing the Shiji as an act of determined endurance that he himself described in a famous letter as the reason he chose to live with the shame rather than die. His history set the template for all subsequent Chinese dynastic histories, which were commissioned by the new dynasty to record the reign of the old one, and which form an extraordinary continuous record of Chinese political history stretching from the Han to the Qing. The Han period was also distinguished by remarkable technological achievement. Paper was invented in China during the Han period, though not by a single inventor in a single moment of inspiration, but through a gradual process of refinement. Cast iron had been produced in China since the Warring States period, centuries before it appeared in Europe. The seismoscope, an early earthquake detector, was invented during the Han. The wheelbarrow appeared. The chain pump for lifting water was developed. The Han dynasty ended not with a bang but with a long, slow dissolution. Provincial warlords growing more powerful, the central government weakening, peasant rebellions spreading, the court torn by factional struggles between the families of empresses and the eunuchs who served the inner palace. In 220 CE, the last Han emperor formally abdicated, and China entered a period of division that would last nearly 4 centuries. Chapter 8: The Three Kingdoms, Heroes and Tragedies. The period immediately following the Han collapse, the Three Kingdoms era from 220 to 280 CE, became one of the most romanticized episodes in Chinese history, celebrated in poetry and drama, and above all in the great historical novel romance of the Three Kingdoms, written in the 14th century CE, but drawing on centuries of accumulated story and legend. The Three Kingdoms were Wei in the north, ruled by the descendants of the brilliant but ruthless general Cao Cao. Shu Han in the southwest, ruled by Liu Bei, who claimed descent from the Han imperial family and whose court was graced by the supreme strategist Zhuge Liang. And Wu in the southeast, ruled by the Sun family and benefiting from its access to the sea and the wealth of the Yangtze Delta. Cao Cao is perhaps the most complex figure of this era, a man of genuine political and military genius, a fine poet, a capable administrator, and also a man capable of great cruelty who massacred civilian populations and eliminated rivals with ruthless efficiency. In the romance of the Three Kingdoms, he is the villain, the usurper who destroyed the Han and whose descendants sat on a throne that was not rightfully theirs. In historical assessment, he is one of the most capable leaders of the age. Liu Bei is the hero of the romance, the man of principle and virtue whose cause was just even though it ultimately failed. His friendship with his sworn brothers Guan Yu and Zhang Fei, his recruitment of the incomparable Zhuge Liang, his tireless effort to restore the Han dynasty, all became the stuff of a cultural mythology that endures today. Guan Yu, the great warrior, was posthumously deified and is still worshipped across the Chinese world as the god of war and righteousness. Zhuge Liang, the sleeping dragon, is the archetypal Chinese strategist, a man who preferred to win through intelligence and planning rather than brute force, who managed limited resources with extraordinary skill, who understood that the moral authority of his cause was as important as its military prowess. He is one of the most beloved figures in Chinese cultural history, a model of loyalty, wisdom, and dedicated service. The Three Kingdoms era ended when the state of Jin, arising from Wei, briefly reunified China before the Jin court dissolved in its own factional struggles, and the north of China was overrun by non-Chinese peoples from the steppe, beginning the period of the 16 kingdoms and the northern and southern dynasties, a long era of division and disruption during which China was politically fragmented but culturally extraordinarily active. Chapter 9: Buddhism comes to China. Of all the transformations that Chinese civilization underwent during the centuries of division following the Han, perhaps the most profound was the absorption of Buddhism. Buddhism had originated in India in the 5th century BCE, with the historical Buddha Siddhartha Gautama, whose teachings about the nature of suffering and the path to its cessation spread across South and Southeast Asia, and via the Silk Road, into Central Asia and eventually China. The first Buddhist missionaries appear to have reached China during the Han dynasty, and a Buddhist community existed at the Han court by the 1st century CE. But Buddhism's great flowering in China came during the centuries of division, when the political and social disruption of the era made people unusually open to religious innovation and spiritual consolation. Buddhism offered things that the traditional Chinese philosophies did not. It had a sophisticated metaphysics, an elaborate cosmology, a professional monastic community, rituals for the dead, and, eventually, a rich artistic tradition of sculpture and painting and architecture that would deeply influence Chinese art. It promised personal salvation, the possibility of escaping the cycle of rebirth and reaching nirvana, a form of liberation that Confucianism and Taoism had not offered in quite this way. But Buddhism also had to adapt to enter China. Chinese culture was not a passive vessel waiting to be filled with Indian ideas. It was a living tradition with deep roots and strong commitments, and Buddhist concepts that contradicted those commitments were challenged and modified. The Buddhist emphasis on the monastic life, on leaving family and abandoning social obligations to pursue individual spiritual liberation, was deeply at odds with the Confucian emphasis on filial piety and social duty. Chinese Buddhists developed elaborate arguments for why supporting the monastic community was itself an act of filial piety, and translated Buddhist texts in ways that made them more compatible with Chinese values. Some of the Buddhist translations made in China during this period are remarkable works of literature in their own right, and the process of translation was extraordinarily difficult. The Indian conceptual vocabulary was different from the Chinese in fundamental ways, and finding Chinese equivalents for Sanskrit terms required creativity and compromise. Early translators often used Taoist terminology to render Buddhist concepts, creating interesting and sometimes confusing overlaps between the two traditions. The Buddhism that eventually took deep root in China was not simply Indian Buddhism transplanted. It was Chinese Buddhism, a new synthesis that combined Indian spiritual technology with Chinese cultural values and aesthetic sensibility. Chan Buddhism, known in Japan as Zen, which emerged during the Tang dynasty and emphasized direct intuitive insight over textual study and elaborate ritual, is perhaps the most distinctly Chinese form of Buddhism, bearing the unmistakable marks of Taoist influence. The great pilgrim Xuanzang, who traveled to India in the 7th century CE to collect Buddhist texts, and returned with hundreds of manuscripts that he spent the rest of his life translating, represents one peak of Buddhist activity in China. His journey was later transformed into one of the greatest works of Chinese literature, the 16th century novel Journey to the West, in which the pilgrim is accompanied by the irrepressible Monkey King, Sun Wukong, whose magical powers and irrepressible personality have made him one of the most beloved characters in Chinese cultural tradition. The absorption of Buddhism changed Chinese civilization in ways that cannot be fully catalogued. In art, in architecture, in philosophy, in literature, in attitudes toward death and the afterlife, in the practice of vegetarianism, in the development of printing, which was first used on a large scale in China to reproduce Buddhist texts. The great Buddhist cave complexes at Dunhuang and Longmen and Yungang are among the most spectacular artistic achievements of the ancient world, their walls and ceilings covered with paintings, and their niches filled with sculptures that represent centuries of devotion and artistic labor. Buddhism was not always welcomed in China. There were periods of suppression, most notably the persecution of 842 to 845 CE under the Tang Emperor Xuanzang, which destroyed thousands of temples and monasteries and forced hundreds of thousands of monks and nuns to return to lay life. But Buddhism survived these persecutions, deeply embedded in Chinese culture and spirituality, and it remains a living presence in China today. Chapter 10: The Sui and the Tang, Reunification and Golden Age. After nearly 4 centuries of division, China was reunified in 589 CE by the Sui dynasty, which lasted only 37 years but accomplished things of lasting importance. It rebuilt the centralized administrative structure on an expanded Qinhan model. It began construction of the Grand Canal connecting the Yellow River and the Yangtze, creating an inland waterway system that would be central to Chinese commerce for 1,000 years. And it revived and elaborated the examination system as the primary pathway to government service. The Sui dynasty destroyed itself through overreach. The second emperor, Yangdi, launched 3 massive military campaigns against the Korean kingdom of Goguryeo, all of which failed at enormous cost in lives and resources. The campaigns triggered rebellions that the dynasty could not suppress. Yangdi was assassinated in 618 CE, and the Tang dynasty, founded by the Li family who had been one of the most powerful Sui military families, rose from the wreckage. The Tang dynasty, ruling from 618 to 907 CE, is remembered as one of the greatest eras in Chinese history. The Tang capital at Chang'an, on the site of the Qin and Han capital near modern Xi'an, was at its height the largest city in the world, with a population of perhaps 1 million people within its walls and suburbs. It was a genuinely cosmopolitan city, home to merchants, monks, and diplomats from across the known world. Persians, Arabs, Turks, Koreans, Japanese, Indians, and others lived in its foreign quarters, worshipped in their own temples and churches and mosques, and brought their goods and their cultures to the markets of the capital. The first Tang emperors were men of considerable ability. Taizong, who reigned from 626 to 649 CE after deposing his father in a palace coup, is one of the most admired rulers in Chinese history. Militarily successful, administratively capable, and genuinely interested in good governance. He was famous for listening to frank criticism from his advisors, understanding that a ruler who punished honest advice would soon have no honest advisors. His chief minister Wei Zheng, who corrected and challenged him repeatedly, became a legendary model of the faithful remonstrating official. Under the Tang, the civil service examination system was expanded and elaborated. The highest examination, the Jinqi degree, was extraordinarily difficult to pass and conferred enormous prestige on those who did. The number of candidates who took the examinations every year was far larger than the number who passed, and the preparation required years of intensive study. But the system created a class of educated officials who shared a common cultural formation, could be posted anywhere in the empire and communicate effectively with colleagues from other regions, and owed their position to demonstrated merit rather than hereditary privilege. The Tang period was a golden age for poetry. The 2 greatest poets in the Chinese tradition, Li Bai and Du Fu, were contemporaries in the Tang court, and the contrast between them reflects something of the richness of Tang culture. Li Bai was the romantic, the Taoist wanderer, the drinker of wine and lover of moonlight, the poet whose verses captured the sheer sensory pleasure of being alive in a world full of rivers and mountains and wine and friendship. Du Fu was the Confucian, the moralist, the man who felt deeply the suffering of the common people and expressed it in verse of aching compassion and technical mastery. Both men lived through the Lushan Rebellion, the catastrophe of 755 CE, when a general of non-Chinese origin who commanded a large part of the Tang army in the northeast rose in revolt, captured the capital, and sent the emperor fleeing to the southwest. The rebellion lasted 8 years, required the help of foreign armies to suppress, and resulted in perhaps the greatest loss of life in Chinese history up to that point. Some estimates suggest that the population of China fell by 1/3 during the years of the rebellion and the disorder that followed. Du Fu's poems from this period are among the most heartrending in Chinese literature. He describes the smoke of burning villages, the old men who stay behind while the young are conscripted, the mothers weeping for sons who will not return, the moonlight falling on ruined cities. There is a famous poem in which he describes finding a ruined cottage after years of wandering, reconstructing his home, and then a storm tears the roof off and he lies awake in the cold, unable to sleep, thinking of all the poor scholars of the world who have no shelter, and wishing for a great mansion with 10,000 rooms to shelter them all. The Tang dynasty survived the Lushan rebellion, but never fully recovered its earlier confidence and coherence. Provincial military governors grew more powerful and more independent. The examination system produced an educated official class, but factional struggles among those officials weakened effective governance. The dynasty ended in 907 CE in a welter of rebellions, warlordism, and famine. The 53 years that followed, the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period, saw a rapid succession of short-lived regimes in the north and a multiplicity of smaller states in the south. But the institutions of the Tang, particularly the examination system and the centralized bureaucratic model, survived and provided the framework for the dynasty that would restore unity. Chapter 11: The Song Dynasty, Prosperity, Neo-Confucianism, and the Shadow of the North. The Song Dynasty, which reunified the Chinese heartland in 960 CE and ruled until 1279, is in many ways the most sophisticated and culturally accomplished of all the Chinese dynasties. It was the period of the most refined Chinese porcelain, the most subtle landscape painting, the most elegant calligraphy, the most developed commercial economy, and the most intellectually ambitious philosophical system since the classical age, Neo-Confucianism. The Song economy was remarkable by any pre-modern standard. China under the Song was probably the most economically developed society on earth. Paper money appeared and was used for large commercial transactions. Maritime trade expanded enormously, with Chinese ships sailing to Southeast Asia, India, and the Persian Gulf. New agricultural techniques, particularly the introduction of fast-ripening rice varieties from Vietnam, doubled agricultural productivity in many areas and allowed the population to grow substantially. Coal was mined on a large scale and used for smelting. Gunpowder, which had been discovered in China during the Tang period, while Taoist alchemists were searching for the elixir of immortality, was now being applied to military use. Fire arrows, bombs, and eventually primitive firearms appeared in Chinese arsenals during the Song. The Song capital at Kaifeng, and later at Hangzhou after the north was lost to the Jurchen Jin dynasty in the 12th century, were great commercial cities, bustling with trade and craft production. The riverside scene at Qingming Festival, a long scroll painting from the early 12th century, gives an extraordinarily detailed picture of Kaifeng. Its streets crowded with merchants, craftsmen, entertainers, donkey carts, sedan chairs, and pedestrians. Its river busy with boats of all sizes. Its restaurants and wine shops and tea houses full of customers. Neo-Confucianism, developed by thinkers like Zhou Dunyi, Zhang Zai, and above all Zhu Zai, was the philosophical system that synthesized Confucian ethics with metaphysical concepts drawn partly from Buddhist and Taoist thought. It provided a comprehensive account of the nature of reality, the proper ordering of human society, and the path of moral self-cultivation that dominated Chinese intellectual life from the Song period onward and spread to Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, where it profoundly shaped those cultures as well. At the center of Neo-Confucian thought was the concept of li, principle or pattern, not to be confused with the earlier Confucian li of ritual propriety. Everything in the universe, from a grain of sand to a human being to the society of heaven, had its li, its defining principle or nature. To understand one's own li, to cultivate it through serious moral effort and the study of the classics, was the path of the superior person. The investigation of things, jiu, examining the world closely to understand its principles, was recommended as a means of moral as well as intellectual development. The Song dynasty faced a chronic military problem. It was surrounded by formidable non-Chinese states that its armies could not decisively defeat. To the north was the Liao dynasty of the Khitan people, then replaced by the Jurchen Jin dynasty, which in 1127 captured the Song capital Kaifeng, took the emperor prisoner, and forced the dynasty to relocate to Hangzhou in the south. This period, the Southern Song, lasted until 1279, when the dynasty was extinguished by the most formidable military force the world had yet produced. Chapter 12. The Mongols, the Storm from the North. The Mongol Empire is the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world, at its greatest extent stretching from Korea to Poland and from the Arctic forests to the Persian Gulf. It was created in the space of roughly 40 years by a man named Temujin, who united the feuding tribes of the Mongolian steppe and took the title Genghis Khan, universal ruler. Genghis Khan was born around 1162 CE into a minor noble family, whose leader had been poisoned by rivals when Temujin was still a child, leaving his family destitute and friendless on the steppe. The story of his rise from those desperate circumstances to the conquest of most of the known world is one of the most extraordinary in human history, combining extraordinary military and political genius with a ruthlessness that produced casualties on a scale that modern historians have struggled to quantify. The Mongol way of war was based on extraordinary mobility, on the skills of a people who had spent their lives on horseback, and on strategic sophistication that combined feigned retreats, encirclements, and coordinated movements across vast distances that their enemies could not match. Mongol armies also adapted quickly to technologies they did not have. Chinese engineers provided siege equipment and expertise that allowed the Mongols to take walled cities that their traditional cavalry tactics could not breach. China fell in stages. The Jurchen Jin dynasty in the north was attacked beginning in 1211 and finally destroyed in 1234. The Southern Song, protected by the natural barrier of the Yangtze River and its sophisticated naval forces, held out longer, but it too fell in 1279 to Genghis Khan's grandson Kublai Khan, who had made himself emperor of China and founded the Yuan dynasty. Kublai Khan's China was visited by the Venetian merchant Marco Polo, who spent 17 years in the service of the Mongol court and returned to describe a civilization of unimaginable wealth and sophistication to European audiences who could barely credit what he told them. His account of the paper money system, of the Grand Canal, of the lavish court of Kublai Khan, of the enormous cities of southern China, reads in places like fantasy. But modern archaeology and documentary history have confirmed that he was broadly accurate. The Yuan dynasty was short-lived. The Mongols never fully integrated into Chinese culture, governing through a hierarchy that placed Mongols and their Central Asian allies above native Chinese. And the resentment this generated, combined with the economic disruptions of Mongol rule and a series of natural disasters, produced the rebellions that would end the dynasty in 1368. Chapter 13. The Ming Dynasty, Walls, Voyages, and Withdrawal. The founder of the Ming Dynasty, Zhu Yuanzhang, was one of the most unlikely rulers in Chinese history. The son of landless peasants, orphaned by famine, who had begged for food and served as a Buddhist novice before joining a rebel movement and rising through the ranks to become its leader, and then the emperor of a unified China. He ruled as the Hongwu Emperor from 1368 to 1398, and his reign combined genuine administrative achievement with a paranoia and brutality that made him one of the most feared rulers in Chinese history. The Hongwu Emperor's distrust of the educated bureaucratic class led him to terrorize his own officials with a thoroughness that earlier emperors had not attempted. The interrogation and execution of officials, sometimes in large groups, was used as a management tool. The office of Prime Minister, which had been the highest non-imperial administrative position since the Qin, was abolished, concentrating all government authority directly in the emperor's hands, a change of lasting consequence. But it was the early 15th century, under the third Ming Emperor, the Yongle Emperor, that the dynasty reached its most dramatic moment of outward projection. Between 1405 and 1433, the eunuch Admiral Zheng he led 7 great maritime expeditions across the Indian Ocean, sailing as far as the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the east coast of Africa. His fleet was enormous. The largest ships, the treasure ships, were reportedly 400 feet long, the largest wooden sailing vessels ever built. The expeditions returned with exotic animals, including giraffes, which were presented as killins, the auspicious mythical creatures that signified heaven's favor, exotic goods, and diplomatic relationships with dozens of states along the Indian Ocean rim. The voyages of Zheng He are one of the great might-have-beens of history. They demonstrated that China had the technological capacity and the organizational ability to dominate maritime trade across much of the known world. Decades before the Portuguese rounded Africa and centuries before European power reached the Indian Ocean in strength. If China had continued and expanded its maritime ventures, the history of the world might have been very different. But the voyages stopped. After 1433, they were not renewed. The reasons are debated: the cost of the expeditions, the opposition of the Confucian bureaucracy who saw them as wasteful and contrary to good governance, the shift of imperial attention to the northern frontier where the Mongol threat had returned, the political eclipse of the eunuch faction that had supported the voyages. Whatever the exact combination of reasons, the decision was made to withdraw, and China turned inward. The Great Wall, in its most familiar form, is largely a Ming creation. The Ming emperors, facing persistent pressure from Mongols and other northern peoples, invested enormous resources in the construction and extension of the northern wall system, building the brick-and-stone fortification that stretches across the mountains north of Beijing, and that has become the most iconic image of China in the world's imagination. The wall was a defensive posture, a choice of containment over expansion, of known borders over unknown horizons. The Ming Dynasty is also the age of China's great novels. The 4 great classical novels, Journey to the West, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Water Margin, and Dream of the Red Chamber, the last of which was actually written in the Qing Dynasty, were produced in or refined in this era. They represent a popular literary culture of enormous vitality, read not only by the educated elite, but by merchants and craftsmen, and anyone who could afford to buy or borrow the printed books that the great commercial publishing houses of the Ming era produced in vast quantities. The Ming Dynasty ended in 1644 when a rebel army captured Beijing, and the last Ming emperor hanged himself on a tree on the hill behind the Forbidden City. The dynasty that replaced it came not from within China, but from the northeast, from Manchuria, and it would be the last dynasty in Chinese history. Chapter 14. The Qing Dynasty, the Last Empire. The Manchu people who founded the Qing Dynasty were not Chinese, and they knew it, and so did the Chinese over whom they ruled. The Qing emperors navigated this tension with extraordinary political skill, presenting themselves to their Chinese subjects as Confucian emperors in the Chinese tradition while maintaining their Manchu identity, and ruling their inner Asian subjects as Khan, the traditional step title of leadership. The early Qing emperors were among the most able rulers in Chinese history. The Kangxi Emperor, who reigned from 1661 to 1722, was arguably the most accomplished. A man of broad intellectual curiosity who learned Latin from Jesuit missionaries at his court, who was genuinely interested in Western astronomy and mathematics, who composed poetry in Chinese and Manchu, who led military campaigns in person, and governed an empire larger than any China had previously encompassed. His reign saw the incorporation of Taiwan, the conquest of the Dzungar Mongols, the negotiation of the Treaty of Nerchinsk with Russia, the first treaty between China and a European power. His grandson, the Qianlong Emperor, who reigned from 1735 to 1796, and then continued to influence affairs for another 3 years, expanded the empire to its greatest extent, incorporating Xinjiang, Tibet, and Mongolia into the Qing domain. He was an enthusiastic patron of literature and art, presiding over a great compilation of Chinese literary heritage, the Siku Quanchu, a vast collection of works from across the Chinese tradition. He was also, in his later years, increasingly dominated by a favorite official, whose corruption was so blatant that the Qianlong Emperor's extraordinary reign ended in a cloud of decline and dysfunction. The Qing dynasty faced mounting difficulties in the 19th century, when the world that China had known changed with a speed and violence that the Confucian administrative tradition was not equipped to handle. The British Empire, enriched by the Industrial Revolution and armed with weapons and ships that no traditional force could match, forced open Chinese markets through the Opium Wars of 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860, extracting treaty ports, extraterritorial rights, and trading concessions in agreements that Chinese would remember as the unequal treaties. Internal rebellions compounded the external pressure. The Taiping Rebellion, which lasted from 1850 to 1864 and was led by Hong Xiuquan, who believed himself to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ, resulted in the deaths of perhaps 30 million people, one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. The Boxer Rebellion of 1900, which began as a movement against foreign influence and ended with a foreign military coalition occupying Beijing and burning the Summer Palace, accelerated the dynasty's terminal crisis. The Qing dynasty ended in 1912, when the last emperor, the child Puyi, abdicated in the face of the revolution that would eventually produce the Republic of China. China's imperial age was over after more than 2,000 years. Chapter 15. The Written Word, Language, Literature, and the Book. No account of ancient China can be complete without dwelling for some time on what is perhaps the most extraordinary achievement of Chinese civilization, its written language. Chinese writing is the oldest writing system still in use in the world. The oracle bone inscriptions of the Shang dynasty, from roughly 1200 BCE, are already recognizably an ancestor of the writing system used in China today, though the path from the archaic Shang script to the modern simplified and traditional characters is long and winding. The system did not change direction. It remained logographic, with characters representing words or morphemes rather than sounds, throughout its history. Even as the spoken languages it was used to transcribe diverged into dialects as mutually unintelligible as French and Spanish. This is one of the most remarkable facts about Chinese writing. It provided a common written medium for people who could not understand each other's speech. A Cantonese speaker and a Mandarin speaker, whose spoken languages are as different as Italian and Portuguese, could read the same classical text and understand it equally. The written language was thus a powerful instrument of cultural unity across a vast and linguistically diverse territory. The characters themselves are objects of aesthetic contemplation as well as practical utility. Calligraphy, the art of writing Chinese characters, is one of the highest art forms in the Chinese tradition, as highly regarded as painting and more fundamentally Chinese than any imported artistic practice. The great calligraphers of Chinese history, Wang Zizhai of the Jin dynasty, Yan Zhenqing of the Tang, Su Shi of the Song, are as celebrated in China as the great painters, and their works have been treasured, copied, and passed down through the centuries as objects of the highest cultural value. The development of printing in China was another world historical achievement. Block printing, in which a text was carved in relief on a wooden block, inked, and pressed onto paper, appears in China by the 7th century CE. Movable type was invented by Bai Sheng in the 11th century CE, 4 centuries before Gutenberg in Europe. The Chinese printing industry produced books in enormous quantities, spreading the examination curriculum, Buddhist texts, medical works, agricultural manuals, historical records, novels, and poetry across the literate population. Literature in China was not a marginal activity. The ability to write poetry was considered an essential accomplishment of any educated person, and the tradition of occasional verse, poems written to mark specific moments and events, was ubiquitous in the lives of the literate. Poems were exchanged as gifts, written on walls, composed at banquets, sent with letters as a more refined form of communication than prose. The examination system required candidates to compose poems in regulated forms, which meant that virtually every official in the imperial government had been trained to write verse. The great Tang poets, Li Bai and Du Fu, have already been mentioned, but the tradition is vast. Tao Yuanming, who lived in the late 4th and early 5th century CE and retired from official life to farm his own land, wrote poems about the simple pleasures of rural existence that have been read and loved ever since. Wang Wei, a Tang poet and painter, captured the atmosphere of mountains and moonlight and the contemplative silence of the natural world in poems of crystalline economy. Su Shi, known as Su Dongpo, was a Song dynasty poet, calligrapher, essayist, and official of extraordinary versatility, whose prose and poetry encompassed humor, grief, philosophical reflection, and sensory delight in equal measure. The tradition of poetry was also a tradition of commentary and memory, of works written in dialogue with earlier works, of poets reading their predecessors and responding to them across centuries. Du Fu read and revered Tao Yuanming. Su Shi read and revered Du Fu and Li Bai. Later poets read all of them. The Chinese literary tradition is not a sequence of isolated voices, but a conversation stretching across millennia. Chapter 16: The Examination System, the Great Ladder. The imperial examination system is one of the most remarkable institutions in the history of human governance, and its influence on Chinese culture was so profound and so pervasive that it is difficult to overstate. The basic idea was simple: entry into the civil service, the government bureaucracy that administered the Chinese Empire, should be based on demonstrated intellectual merit rather than on birth or connection. Candidates who passed a series of increasingly difficult examinations would be eligible for government posts. Those who failed would remain commoners, however wealthy or well-connected their families. In practice, the system was more complex. The examinations tested primarily mastery of the Confucian classics and the ability to write in certain prescribed forms, including the notorious eight-legged essay, a highly formalized composition with a fixed structure that critics argued stifled independent thought. The education required to prepare for the examinations was expensive and time-consuming, giving the wealthy a significant advantage over the poor. The numbers passing were small. In some periods, perhaps one candidate in 10,000 taking the highest examination would pass. And yet the system had genuine effects. Families that invested in their sons' education might see those sons rise to high position and bring wealth and prestige to the whole family. Stories of poor boys who studied by lamplight and rose to become great officials were not merely legend. They happened, often enough to give the system genuine credibility as a pathway of merit. The examination system created a class of educated officials who shared a common cultural formation. They had all read the same texts, written in the same forms, been judged by the same criteria. This common formation was a powerful source of administrative coherence across a vast empire. The examination halls were extraordinary places. Candidates were confined in individual cells, barely large enough to sit in, for 3 days at a time, with no communication with the outside world, writing their essays by lamplight while eunuch guards patrolled the corridors. The physical and psychological demands were severe. Candidates sometimes went mad or died during the examinations. The emotional investment of years of preparation, the family hopes resting on a single performance, and the isolation of the examination cell created conditions of intense stress. Passing the Jinshi examination was a public triumph. The names of the successful candidates were posted on a wall, and crowds gathered to read them. Successful candidates were feted and celebrated. Their families held banquets. Local communities built memorial arches in their honor. The examination system created a kind of public drama of success and failure that engaged the whole literate community. The system also created a culture of exam preparation and pedagogical method that shaped Chinese education for centuries. The emphasis on memorization, on the mastery of a canonical text, on the ability to compose within strict formal constraints, produced a particular kind of mind, one that was highly trained in the manipulation of textual material and the application of established principles, but that was not always encouraged to challenge those principles or think outside the forms. The examination system was abolished in 1905 as part of the reforms attempted by the late Qing government in the face of the modern world's challenges. Its abolition removed one of the central organizing principles of Chinese social life and left a vacuum that the 20th century would fill in various ways. Chapter 17: Silk Tea and the Silk Road. China gave the world silk, and for much of history, the West was willing to pay almost any price for it. The secret of silk production, sericulture, was one of the most jealously guarded technological secrets in the ancient world. The process begins with the silkworm, the caterpillar of the moth Bombyx mori, which feeds on white mulberry leaves and produces a cocoon of a single continuous thread of raw silk that can be as long as 900 meters. To unwind the thread, the cocoon must be immersed in hot water to dissolve the gum that holds it together, and then the thread is carefully reeled off. Multiple threads are then twisted together to make a thread strong enough to weave. The resulting fabric, silk, is extraordinarily beautiful, lustrous, lightweight, strong, capable of holding dye in vivid colors and pleasant against the skin. It was valued in China as a luxury good from earliest times and was used as a form of currency, paid as tribute and accumulated as wealth. The Chinese government maintained strict prohibitions on exporting silkworm eggs or teaching the technology of silk production to foreigners, on pain of death. Despite these prohibitions, silk itself traveled westward along the trade routes that became known as the Silk Road. The term Silk Road is a modern one, coined by a German geographer in the 19th century, and it somewhat simplifies a reality that was more complex. Not a single road, but a network of overland and maritime routes connecting China with Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually the Mediterranean world. The overland routes cross some of the most formidable terrain on Earth. The Taklamakan Desert, whose name is sometimes translated as "you go in but you don't come out." The Pamir Mountains, some of the highest and most treacherous passes in the world. The vast expanse of the Iranian Plateau. The Syrian Desert. The oasis cities along the way, Dunhuang, Kashgar, Samarkand, Merv, became wealthy entrepôts where goods were exchanged and merchants rested and resupplied. Along with silk traveled other Chinese goods: porcelain, tea, spices, lacquerware. Coming the other way came glassware and gold from the Roman world, cotton and pepper from India, horses from Central Asia, the Buddhist religion, new crops and fruits, astronomical knowledge, and eventually Islam. The Silk Road was not just a trade route, but a corridor of cultural exchange, the channel through which ideas and technologies and religions moved between the great civilizations of Eurasia. Tea, like silk, is a Chinese gift to the world. The habit of drinking tea was already established in China by the Tang dynasty, when the tea master Lu Yu wrote the Classic of Tea, a comprehensive guide to tea cultivation, preparation, and appreciation that is one of the most charming books ever written about a single subject. By the Song dynasty, the tea ceremony had become an art form, with particular bowls, particular whisks, particular methods of preparation elevated to the level of aesthetic practice. Tea traveled to Japan with Buddhist monks and became there the foundation of the Japanese tea ceremony, Chado, the way of tea, one of the most refined aesthetic practices in any culture. It traveled westward more slowly, reaching Europe in the 17th century, where it would become so important to British culture that the British East India Company would eventually go to war over it, in a roundabout way, since the Opium Wars were fundamentally about the trade imbalance caused by British demand for Chinese tea. The porcelain that traveled along the Silk Road and by sea was another Chinese technological achievement without parallel. The finest Chinese porcelain of the Song and later dynasties, thin-walled, translucent, ringing like a bell when struck, decorated with painting of extraordinary delicacy, was the most sought-after ceramic product in the world. Europeans tried for centuries to reproduce it and failed. The secret of true porcelain was not discovered in Europe until the early 18th century, at the Meissen factory in Germany. The Celadon glazes of the Song, the blue and white porcelain of the Yuan and Ming made with cobalt oxide from Central Asia, the Famia rose and Famia vert of the Qing. These are among the most beautiful objects ever made by human hands, and they were made in enormous quantities, for domestic use and for export, by the great kilns of Jingdezhen in Jiangxi province, which was producing porcelain on an industrial scale centuries before the Industrial Revolution. Chapter 18. Farming Floods. And the land. Beneath all the dynasties and philosophies and artistic achievements of ancient China lies the fundamental reality of the land and the people who worked it. China's civilization was built on agriculture, and the vast majority of its people, throughout its history, were farmers. The geography of China presented farmers with both remarkable opportunities and daunting challenges. The less soils of the north were fertile and easily worked, but the rainfall was erratic, and the great rivers were prone to flooding. The wet paddies of the south were extraordinarily productive when properly managed, but required enormous labor to construct and maintain the levees and irrigation systems they depended on. The mountains that covered much of southern and southwestern China limited arable land, but provided resources of timber, minerals, and biodiversity. Chinese farmers developed over millennia a detailed and sophisticated knowledge of their land and its management. The choice of crops, the rotation of fields, the management of soil fertility through composting, and the application of human waste, the construction of terraced hillsides to prevent erosion and capture rainfall, the breeding of improved varieties of crops, all of these practices reflected accumulated knowledge of extraordinary depth. The introduction of Champa rice, a fast-maturing variety from Vietnam, during the Song dynasty, was one of the most consequential agricultural innovations in Chinese history. It allowed 2 or even 3 crops per year in the south, dramatically increasing productivity and supporting population growth. China's population, which had been roughly 50 million in the Han period, grew to perhaps 100 million by the Song and 2 or 3 times that by the late Qing, fed by these intensifying agricultural practices. But the relationship between people and land was never easy. The Yellow River, which sustained northern Chinese civilization, also periodically devastated it. The river's propensity to flood was caused by the enormous load of silt it carried from the Les Plateau, which raised the river bed over time until the river was flowing above the level of the surrounding plain, held in place only by the levees that farmers had been building and maintaining for centuries. When the levees broke, as they did periodically in catastrophic floods, the results were devastating. Fields inundated, villages drowned, millions displaced or killed. The management of the Yellow River was one of the perennial challenges of Chinese governance. The Yellow River Conservancy, the government office responsible for maintaining the levees and dredging the channel, was one of the most important and also most notoriously corrupt government departments throughout the imperial period. Properly maintained, the river sustained civilization. Neglected, it destroyed it. The same tension between the generosity and the violence of the natural world runs through all of Chinese agricultural history. Drought and flood were constant threats, and the government's ability to manage these threats by maintaining granaries, building irrigation works, keeping roads open for the movement of relief supplies, was a central measure of dynastic competence. A dynasty that managed the rivers and the granaries well was a dynasty that kept the mandate of heaven. One that failed was a dynasty in trouble. The farmers themselves lived lives of seasonal rhythm, planting in spring, weeding through summer, harvesting in autumn, resting and repairing in winter. The great festivals of the Chinese calendar, the Lunar New Year, the Qingming Tomb Sweeping Festival, the Dragon Boat Festival, the Mid-Autumn Moon Festival, were agricultural festivals at root, celebrations of the seasons and the harvest, expressions of gratitude for the land's generosity and supplication for its continued favor. The farmhouses of the Chinese countryside were modest structures of earth and timber, with courtyards where the family animals were kept, where vegetables were grown, where the thrashing was done after the harvest. The interior was dark and smoky, warmed in the north by the kang, a heated platform that served as bed and sitting area. The family ate together from shared dishes, seated on low stools or kneeling on mats, using chopsticks that had been a feature of Chinese table culture since at least the Shang dynasty. Life was hard and often short. Disease, famine, and the violence of rebellions and wars were constant threats. The tax burden could be crushing, particularly at the end of a dynasty when administrative efficiency had declined and corrupt officials extracted more than was officially due. And yet the farmers of China endured, generation after generation, working the same fields their ancestors had worked, preserving the knowledge of agriculture and craft and local custom that was the deep substrate of Chinese civilization, the foundation on which everything else rested. Chapter 19, The Forbidden City and the Court. In the center of Beijing, behind walls of deep red, stands the Forbidden City, the palace complex of the Ming and Qing emperors, the largest surviving palace complex in the world, and one of the most magnificent architectural achievements of any civilization. It was built between 1406 and 1420 under the direction of the Yongle Emperor, who moved the capital from Nanjing to Beijing and wanted a palace worthy of the empire he governed. The construction required the labor of hundreds of thousands of workers and craftsmen, the timber from forests in the southwest, and stone quarried from mountains north of the city. The result was a city within a city, an enclosure of nearly 72 hectares containing hundreds of buildings arranged along a central axis that ran from south to north, embodying in architecture the cosmological principle that the emperor was the pivot of heaven and earth, the point at which the divine and human worlds met. The emperor lived in the inner court of the Forbidden City, accessible only to the imperial family, the eunuchs who served the inner palace, and specially permitted officials. The outer court contained the great ceremonial halls where the emperor conducted official business, received ambassadors, conducted the great state rituals, issued edicts. The Gate of Supreme Harmony, the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the Hall of Middle Harmony, the Hall of Preserving Harmony. The names capture the aspiration, at least, of the institution. Life within the Forbidden City was governed by an elaborate system of protocol and ceremony that regulated every aspect of the emperor's day. When the emperor rose, what he ate, how he was dressed, who could speak to him and in what posture, what ceremonies marked the new year and the harvest and the imperial birthdays, all was prescribed and maintained by an army of officials, eunuchs, and palace women whose function was partly administrative and partly theatrical, because the emperor was always performing his role, always enacting the cosmic order that his position required him to embody. The eunuchs of the Chinese court are a fascinating and often misunderstood institution. Castrated men who served in the inner palace were a feature of Chinese courts from ancient times, but they proliferated enormously in the later dynasties. Because eunuchs could not have legitimate heirs and were not members of any great family, Emperors often trusted them more than they trusted the regular officials whose family loyalties might conflict with their loyalty to the throne. But this logic created its own dangers. Eunuchs who accumulated too much imperial trust could become enormously powerful, as the eunuch Zheng He's patron showed, or enormously corrupt, as many others demonstrated. The women of the imperial harem are another neglected dimension of court life. The emperor's women, from the empress down through consorts of various ranks to serving women, constituted a separate world within the Forbidden City, governed by its own hierarchy and its own politics. The competition for the emperor's favor, and through that favor the advancement of one's children or relatives, was intense and sometimes ruthless. The Empress Dowager, the mother of the reigning emperor, could be a figure of immense power, particularly when the emperor was young or weak. The Empress Dowager Cixi, who effectively governed China in the late Qing period for decades, is the most famous example. The Forbidden City today is a museum, open to millions of visitors each year, its great courts filled with tourists where once only officials and palace servants walked. The paint is restored, the roofs maintained, the great bronze lions at the gates polished bright. But something of the original atmosphere still clings to the place, in the silence of the inner courts in the early morning before the crowds arrive, in the shadow of the great ceremonial halls. In the particular quality of the light on the yellow glazed roof tiles that catches the sun, in a way that makes the whole complex seem to float slightly above the ground. These roofs were the color of the emperor. Yellow was the imperial color, reserved exclusively for the emperor's use, a visual statement of cosmic centrality visible from any elevated point in the city. Chapter 20. The River at Night, Returning to Rest. We have traveled a long way together, from the Neolithic villages of the Yellow River Valley to the Forbidden City, from the oracle bones of the Shang to the examination halls of the Ming, from the sage kings of antiquity to the last Qing emperor stepping down from a throne that had existed in one form or another for more than 2,000 years. China's history is too large to be contained in any single telling. What we have done here is walk some of the paths, sit by some of the fires, hear some of the voices. There are whole dynasties we have barely mentioned, whole traditions, whole regions, whole ways of life that deserve their own long telling. The women whose names do not appear in the histories, but who managed households and raised children, and kept alive the practical knowledge of craft and cultivation that sustained civilization through every political upheaval. The merchants whose energy and ingenuity created the commercial networks that tied the empire together, but who were